Chastity belts, devices that were reportedly worn by women in the Middle Ages to prevent sexual intercourse, are often referenced in popular culture as an extreme method of enforcing fidelity. But these belts are curiously missing from most legitimate medieval texts, which initially puzzled historians. So what are chastity belts, and did women wear them? According to curators at the Semmelweis Museum in Budapest, which exhibited the history of the chastity belt in 2010, the belts were thought to be introduced as an answer to unchecked female promiscuity when knights left for battles, pilgrimages, or religious crusades. Krakows, also known as the poulain, were a popular style of pointed and elongated shoes favored by nobility during the medieval period. The shoes featured long, skinny points that extended outwards from the toes, and the points could be as long as 4 to 20 inches. But why were they such fashionable items for nearly 150 years during the 14th and 15th centuries? Named after the Polish city of Krakow, the shoes were worn by anyone in Europe who could afford them. They were commonly stuffed with moss and other types of filling to keep their shape, so they didn't flop around. They often featured decorative elements and embossing and were typically made of leather, but other materials were also used in their construction. Worn largely by men, although by some women as well, crows could be quite sexy because they were low-cut and showed off a man's ankles during a time when they wore shorter tunics and revealed more of their legs. Footwear became popular not long after the Black Death, or bubonic plague, killed an estimated 25 million people. This type of retail therapy may have been a coping mechanism in response to so much tragedy. Throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, animals were, as it turns out, tried for human crimes. Animals were arraigned in court on charges ranging from murder to obscenity. Pigs, dogs, cows, rats, and even flies and caterpillars were arraigned in court with full ceremony. They would call witnesses and evidence was heard on both sides. They would grant a form of legal aid, a lawyer to the animal that was accused in order to conduct the animal's defense. As it said in Edward Payson Evans's book The Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals in 1266, a pig was accused of actually eating a human being. After a trial that was held, the pig was found guilty and sentenced, by the monks of St. Genevieve, to death by public burning. The fork was introduced to Europe in the 10th century by Theophane, Byzantine wife of Emperor Otto II. It made its way to Italy by the 11th century and had become popular amongst merchants by the 14th. When the fork was first introduced as an eating implement, it was normal for people to have their knife and fork made, which would be kept in a special box called a cadena. Whenever someone threw a dinner party or a feast, all the guests would bring their cadenas to eat with. This custom was then introduced to France in the entourage of Catherine de' Medici. Forks, however, never really caught on in Britain. Whilst our European cousins were tucking in their new eating irons, the British simply laughed at this feminine affectation of the Italians. British men would eat with their fingers and be proud. What's more, even the Church was against the use of forks. Some writers for the Roman Catholic Church declared it an excessive delicacy. God in His wisdom had provided us with natural forks in our fingers, and it would be an insult to Him to substitute them for these metallic devices. Eventually, we caught on around the 18th century, about the same time that the curved, four-tined variety became popular after its development in Germany. Getting a divorce in the Middle Ages was a hard process, literally. The only way a man could stop his wife from leaving him was to get a full-blown erection in the middle of a cold, calculating courtroom, proving he was up to the task to perform his sacred husbandly duties. But if they wanted to avoid the ignominy of pushing rope in front of a judge, there was one way to dig themselves out of that hole. All they needed to do was to invoke the ancient right of trial by combat. and then crawl back into the hole. Medieval trials by combat typically adhered to ethical hitman rules: no women, no children, and no lepers. These were at the mercy of their champions, men willing to fight in their stead. But there was one exception: marital disputes. Since a wife would have a hard time talking her husband into picking a fight with himself, and if she could, why get divorced at all, European courts allowed her the rare privilege of picking up arms herself. This practice was commonplace and weird enough to warrant an entire chapter in the dueling manual written by legendary fencing instructor Hans Talhofer. In his 1467 book, Talhofer showcases the insane lengths judges went to make the husband and wife duel a fair fight. As opposed to regular duels, the defendant wasn't allowed to pick their weapon of choice. Women, unaccustomed to the tools of war, were given the medieval equivalent of a prison tube sock filled with used batteries, a rock wrapped in a piece of cloth. Men, on the other hand, got to fight with a wooden club of equal length. If that doesn't seem fair at all, the judges agreed. That's why they had to do it with one hand tied behind their back while standing chest deep in a 3-foot wide hole. And in medieval London, according to the Pictorial History of England, the notorious Tower of London even had a special dungeon dedicated to rat torture. It was located beneath the water line of the River Thames, and prisoners would be tossed into the pitch-black space during low tide. As the tide came in and the water rose, rats would float in along with it. The prisoners wouldn't be able to see the creatures, but they would hear their feet scurrying about and feel them crawling across their bodies as they lay helplessly on the cold floor. Catholic partisans even claimed that the flesh torn from the arms and legs of prisoners during sleep by the well-known voracity of these animals. These early forms of rat torture were certainly simple, and the fear of the method was likely more intense than the actual pain for many victims. However, as time went on, the techniques became more and more depraved, and soon rat torture was one of the most gruesome ways to die. Up to 3 or 4 men were often required for the job, with one shoveling the feces into buckets, another pulling those up with a rope, and the rest carrying those loads onto their cart. With medieval toilet chutes a precarious opening for enemy invaders, Gong farmers were often asked to thwart any attackers if possible. It wasn't uncommon for Gong farmers to bring their young practitioners along. With their small size and nimble bodies, small boys were able to maneuver around these small spaces with ease. In addition to cleaning out the actual pit, these stool farmers were also expected to wash out the chutes leading into it. While any valuable items like jewelry that fell into these toilets surely cropped up on occasion and made for a fine surprise, Gong farmers largely relied on actual farmers who paid handsomely for the feces, as it made for excellent natural fertilizer for their crops. However, the work itself appeared rather well rewarded. Cats in the Middle Ages were generally disapproved of, and regarded as, at best, useful pests and, at worst, agents of Satan, owing to the medieval church and its association of the cat with evil. Before the widespread acceptance of Christianity, however, cats were considered valuable members of society and were even worshipped in some cultures. The cat lost its former position through the efforts of the medieval church, which encouraged the association of the cat with devils and darkness as part of their long-standing agenda of demonizing pagan faiths, rituals, and values. Once the cat was associated with Satan, it was regularly tortured and killed either to ward off bad luck, as a sign of devotion to Christ, or as an integral part of rituals involving alluromancy. Cats were condemned by popes and massacred by entire villages and would not regain even half their former status until the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century. The Victorian age of the 19th century would see the cat's full restoration in status. Law and order was harsh in medieval England. However, before being subjected to any deadly punishment, these ranging from the rack to thumbscrews, the accused would undergo one of 3 ordeals. These included the ordeal by fire, whereby an accused person held a red-hot iron bar and walked 3 paces. If the accused hand healed after 3 days, then they were innocent; if not, they were guilty. There was the ordeal by water, where an accused person was tied up and thrown into a pond. If they floated, then they were guilty. Finally, the ordeal by combat was used by noblemen who would fight with their accuser. Whoever won was right, and whoever lost was usually left for dead. Price of salt in the Middle Ages. Since the price of salt, just like the price of any other good, is highly dependent on the time and place you look at, I decided to look at the price of salt in London during the year 1438. So if you want to compare the costs and get a feeling for the buying power money had back then in London during the year 1438, 3 pounds of salt did cost 1 penny, which was equivalent to 1/4 of the daily pay of a craftsman and roughly the price of 4 gallons of ale. So while salt was pricey in the Middle Ages, it was not worth its weight in gold. If we assume that the price of salt in medieval Europe was roughly between 1/8, 1/4 of the daily pay of a craftsman throughout the Middle Ages, then we see that salt was definitively valuable but still affordable for normal people and not just for extremely wealthy people. Just imagine you would have to pay 1/4 of your daily pay for 3 pounds of salt. Granted, that would still be a lot of money compared to today's price of salt, but it would still be somewhat affordable, especially considering how long 3 lbs of salt would last. Today most of us use table salt to season our food. And while that was also done in the Middle Ages, the true value of salt was not so much in being able to season food but in being able to preserve perishable foods like fish or meats by curing them. Cured meat and fish, bacon, and ham all needed a certain amount of salt. Curing 2 pounds of meat took roughly 4 ounces of salt. Curing 2 pounds of fish, roughly 12 ounces of salt were used in the Middle Ages. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more videos.